Welcome everyone to another episode of To The Point with Greg and Grant. This is the podcast that gets to the point, stays on point, and makes a point. We are focused on the aerospace defense industry, as you guys already know. Greg, would you like to say hi?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Grant. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another episode, and certainly glad you could join us.
All right, enough of that. Let's get to the point. And today our special guest has a master's in physics from Northeastern University in Boston. He has multiple publications under his name. He has 27 years experience at Lockheed Martin alone with such titles as Chief Scientist, Chief Engineer, Lockheed Martin Fellow. He is currently the founder and owner of a company that specializes in remote sensing by the name of Serious Science. Please join me in welcoming to the show Ellis Freedman.
Thank you.
So, Ellis, you have quite an accomplished career. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in engineering? Was there something that inspired you to enter into the field?
Frankly, it wasn't really engineering that I started out in. As a child, I actually wanted to go into physics, way back when, from the third grade, strangely enough. And I pursued physics all the way through the master's degree. I stopped short of the PhD because I really didn't see applications for it. Things were changing rapidly. And the particular school that I was getting my master's at, Northeastern, they basically said that I would have to specialize in either solid state or particle physics. And I really didn't care about either of those, so I simply stopped at the master's. And when I left, we were basically at the end of a recession. I had a hard time finding a job. So I ended up paying to get a job as a COBOL programmer, which didn't work out very well, to say the least. And after 3 months in a miserable position, I got an interview with a company called VEDA, V-E-D-A, and I went for that. And they asked me, what do you really want to do with your career? I said, I don't care what it is, I just want a job where I have to think. And they said, that's it? That's all I care about. And they made me the offer and I took it. And it turns out VEDA was a systems engineering firm. And that was my big introduction to engineering.
Gotcha.
And there I spent perhaps 5.5 years. And there I worked on things like radar, infrared systems, some avionics flight control for the old F-14 fighter aircraft. I worked on some missile systems, and I built a fairly large simulation of air combat.
Wow, that's quite a variety of efforts.
Well, it was a full service house, but it was systems level.
Gotcha.
I wasn't down designing electronics or programming an assembly code. I was simply coming up with concepts and algorithms and things like that. And eventually, I felt that I'd outgrown the company. I wanted to learn more, and that's when I took a job at GE Aerospace. And I was warned, frankly, at the time. They said, oh, you're going to be pigeonholed. You're not going to be able to do everything you want to do. You're going to get one job that you have to do over and over again.
That's because they want to keep you.
Well, maybe. GE was actually a good stepping stone. Now, as it turns out, GE Aerospace eventually was sold to Martin Marietta, which joined with Lockheed to become Lockheed Martin, which is where I eventually took early retirement. But one of the nice things about GE was they used to have something called the Advanced Course in Engineering. So in my early years, I should say, I was given the opportunity to take classes in engineering, something I hadn't done before because I was physics. And what they did was they would bring in experts either from the company or from industry or from local colleges. And they would teach you a different form of engineering every single week. And every week, you and your study group, you got to form your own study group, had to solve an engineering problem that had really been encountered out there and write a report and submit that report every week. So they would start you out with something called the drop force problem, which was basically a differential equation problem. And eventually they would work you through everything. I had never worked with true electronics before. In 1 week, I designed a fast Fourier transform in electronics 1 week. I designed a memory management unit the next week.
Oh, wow.
Eventually, we went into linear programming. We did thermodynamics, 3 different weeks, conductive, convective, and radiative. Let's see. We did communication, bit error problems, things I'd never worked on before. This was all over 2 semesters. And they provided credits if I wanted to go on to graduate school from the course.
Oh, wow.
And then the next year you could take something, that was called the A course. And then the B course was another course they gave. So the next year I took that, and I believe that was engineering math, although they alternated that with orbital mechanics. And that's about where I stopped. And the rest is basically history. From there on, I kept going.
So it really gave you that aperture to delve into other disciplines.
Exactly.
In the field, right?
They always told us in the A course that GE wanted people who could handle any kind of engineering. And that's why they exposed you to every kind of engineering in the A course and the B course. They said those are the people that make it to the top.
That's great.
Hmm.
Out of all those different courses, which one did you find the most useful in your career as you progressed?
That's a tough one. Depends what you mean by useful. I'd like to say illuminating more than useful.
Okay.
And I think that was the part on the microprocessor programming, where you really got down to how every bit is moved around and how it's used. Mind you, I've used everything. I've used the differential equations, I've used matrix algebra, I've used radiative heating and cooling. I've done everything, but I think that was the most illuminating. Maybe that's because it got down to the real guts of hardware that I hadn't touched before.
Interesting.
So with your time at Lockheed, what do you feel was the most dynamic position while you were there? You had a lot of different positions within Lockheed Martin, correct?
A fair number, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think they all obviously are important in their own ways. What was the most impactful position you had while you were there, do you think?
Depends what you mean by impactful. Impactful to me or impactful to...
For you.
Yeah. That was probably my early time on the Landsat 7 project. I was pulled into Landsat 7 to replace someone else very early on. We had been given the contract to build the entire Landsat 7 system. That was including the satellite itself, the sensors. Well, we were managing the sensors, they were subcontracted, and the ground. And it gave me a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do. And that's actually where I published my first papers on the calibration of Landsat. And it gave me an opportunity to fix things that people didn't realize were broken in the past. And it also gave me a full group to manage. And it introduced me to, at that time, a new world for me, which was NASA. And some of the other contractors I'd never dealt with, such as Santa Barbara Research out in California.
Excellent.
Was there a particular location of NASA that you worked the most closely with?
It was almost always NASA Goddard.
Goddard.
Yeah, down in Greenbelt, Maryland.
Yep.
I see you know them.
Yes, I do. I know them well. Yeah.
Now, there are so many different applications of remote sensing out there, and I know that you give presentations from time to time talking about remote sensing. You know, some of those areas could include gathering intelligence, real estate, farming, weather. Are there particular areas that you feel are more challenging than others with remote sensing?
That's an interesting question. challenging in the sense that it's hard to get an accurate answer.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
I would think, my own opinion is, well, there are two of them. One of them is meteorology. Meteorology in the sense that, and I've been speaking to people about this lately, when you do things like try to measure the temperature of the atmosphere as a function of altitude, there's some very complicated algorithms that try to derive that based upon some relatively straightforward measurements. They're not, I'm sure people will disagree with me on this, but sometimes there are non-unique solutions to that. And sometimes they're not as accurate as they would like them to be. I consider that a very difficult problem.
Yeah.
The atmosphere is constantly changing. Sometimes you get measurements from different sensors at different times, so you may not have contemporaneous states of the atmosphere that you can read, which will jive between the sensors. It's very difficult. The other one, this is sort of an ongoing discussion I have with people, and I think I've ruffled a few feathers on this one, and that is when they try to measure the exact reflectance of things on the ground. Now, there are two problems with that. One is, again, atmospheric interference, and I worked a lot on that. But the other is this problem of defining exactly what you mean by the reflectance of something on the ground. Because everything has what's called a BRDF, a bidirectional reflectance distribution function. And what that means is that the reflectance of light varies as a function of the illumination angle and the observing angle,
That makes sense.
both in elevation and azimuth, and the orientation of whatever is on the ground. And the problem is, people will say, okay, well, I know the reflectance of this for, say, Landsat, just to give you an example of what I know. Landsat crosses the equator at roughly 10:15 in the morning. So they try to keep the sun angle the same. But the sun angle does change. And let's suppose you're trying to get the reflectance of clover on the ground, let's say. But if the ground is not level, then you're going to get a different reading than if the ground is level, because it's just reflecting a different amount of light at a different angle. Very often people will confuse that with being a diffuse source. In other words, something illuminates it and the light goes evenly in all angles, which is a nice simplifying assumption, which you almost have to make. But people confuse that with what's really going on, and it becomes a real issue. And some people understand it, but in the user community, sometimes they say, I know it's a problem, but I'll take what I can get. I know it sounds strange, but that's exactly what happens, because they can't control the money generally.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just cannot get the answer you want.
Yeah.
And this comes up in a whole bunch of situations, not only as a function of sun angle and Planet Labs, or Planet as they call themselves now. They have a swarm of what they call Dove satellites. I think it's 300 or so satellites.
Yep.
But they're not all seeing at the same angles for every shot, so there will be subtle differences. Not to mention the fact that the atmosphere changes between the time each satellite sees a point on the ground.
So the assumptions, they're keeping the assumptions the same for all the different.
Well, sometimes they try to correct it.
Yeah. Okay.
But how? In order to correct for some of these things, you have to know everything about what you're looking at.
Yeah.
And if you knew everything about what you're looking at, you wouldn't need to look at it in the first place. So you take what you can get.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's basically the big issue here.
Yeah.
And there's a correlated issue, which I was working on for a long time, and that is calibration. And for a long time they called me Mr. Calibration, which I really didn't like.
No?
No, because it wasn't really my preferred specialty. It's just I kept working on it because needing help on it. But, and I don't want to get into too much detail,
Yeah,
but the problem with calibration is you're trying to compare the output of one thing to the output of another, so you'll be able to make a relative measurement. And then they talk about absolute calibration. So they say, oh, I know what this thing is over on the left. If I compare the output of that to the one on the right, and I make them the same, then I know exactly what it is. And I've always made the philosophical argument, how do you know what the original one was? If you don't know what you're comparing to, then how can you say it's absolute? And they say, well, we calibrated that. And I go, against what? Okay, and how do you know that was correct? And you get into this endless loop discussion of, well, the errors aren't big, and then what happens is errors propagate down the line, kind of like whisper down the lane, and then people say, oh, I know the absolute value of this. Well, no, you don't. You just think you do, and it becomes an ongoing argument. And I kind of gave up on that after many years. Nobody wanted to hear it. So anyway, so those are, I guess, three things that are really challenging.
Yeah.
Do you see any new areas that remote sensing can help with that maybe people aren't focused on currently? Obviously weather farming, like we said before, it's kind of a natural fit. But do you see any new uses, new applications?
Well, there are always some things floating around out there. What I find fascinating is some of the small commercial things that are coming out now. I, for example, have a couple of attachments to my phone. One is a thermal infrared imager, which was cheap. And it's not perfect, don't get me wrong, but it enables an everyday user to be able to take infrared photos of things like buildings to see where they're getting heat leaks, for example. I also have another device that I attach to my phone, which actually uses radar to penetrate walls to make a sort of super stud finder instead of just taking a stud finder, which works on magnetic inductance. This thing actually sees through walls. It will tell you, oh, there's a pipe behind the wall, and it will actually display a picture of a pipe as you run your phone.
I completely need that.
Okay.
Yeah, let me have that application.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I just used it. If I'd known, I would have brought it with me. Anyway, so things are coming along, especially with the miniaturization of many of these things. And these things are floating out into space, no pun intended, on things like CubeSats, which are going out there. There's always something. Now, there are new avenues that are always being pursued. People kick them around. I don't see a whole lot of work being done in it. At the moment, I am pushing for a satellite, whether it be commercial or civil, that will work in the mid-infrared region. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but as you go beyond the visible, you go to what's called near-infrared. Near-infrared is around 1 micron, and that's the wavelength that your remote controls use for TVs and whatever else. When you go a little bit longer into the shortwave infrared in the 2-point-something micron range, that's currently being used on things like Landsat. And that can be used for, if you've got sharp enough image lines, to look for things like mineralogical deposits, among other things. There's also something I'd like to look into. It's very noisy, but you may be able to image the Earth at night, not with thermal, but with reflected light, because the atmosphere for a long time during the night produces something called night glow. It has to do with the ionization in the upper atmosphere, and it gives off shortwave infrared light, which goes in all directions. It goes down and it goes up. And today, they make handheld cameras that will actually image at night using this night glow. And it looks like, for the most part, like visible imagery.
That's amazing.
I'd like to see if we can do it from orbit. You've got a lot of interference because the light's shining in your sensor as well.
Yeah.
But you can go out and buy these things right now. So that's another up-and-coming application. It's been around for a while, but I don't think people have taken advantage of it.
It's just more commercialized. It sounds like it's coming.
Yeah, it's coming. I mean, it's built. A major manufacturer over in Princeton makes it right now. Now, once you get beyond shortwave infrared, you go to midwave. Midwave is typically used for measuring things like the temperature of furnaces, like semiconductor furnaces that use in foundries. But my own experience shows that you can actually image with that in a particular window from about 3.5 microns to 4.1 microns, the ground. And it's thermal. You can see the heat from things on the ground. I'm pushing that because right now when people think about thermal imaging, they think about what's called long-wave infrared, which is actually in the 8 to 12 micron range. And that's fine. The energy from the Earth peaks in that wavelength region, which gives you a good strong signal. The problem is that the wavelength is so long that you end up having a very blurry image, or you end up with a very large, what's called GSD, or pixel on the ground. So right now, for example, I believe the latest Landsat images at a native 100 meters, whereas in their visible part, they image at 30 meters. You could probably do 30 meters or better. In fact, I think you can get down to about 10 or 15 meters with midwave infrared. You'd still be able to do temperature estimation at night. During the day, it's problematic, but at night you could do that. It would give you much finer imagery. And midwave also has advantages of it sees water as a very bright object. So you'll be able to track things like runoff from streams, puddling. You might actually be able to see some heavy moisture in soil. It's also been suggested to use that for fire detection. If you can see it often enough, you could monitor the United States for forest fires that are starting up that you haven't spotted yet. There are all sorts of these other applications out there. I'm pushing for that one because it gives better resolution and it has other uses. I don't think anybody's using that right now in space.
Yeah.
And I believe we can do it fairly cheaply.
Wow, that's fascinating. So to end the podcast, we'd like to come up with a fun question. And the question for you, Ellis, is if you were going to Mars, only could bring 3 things with you, and it can't be your family or friends or pets, what would you bring?
Am I limited in size?
It's open.
Okay. Wow.
We stumped you? I can't
No.
believe it.
He just has a lot to consider.
Yes, right. A fully stocked habitat with
All right.
food and oxygen and water.
Very practical.
Is that 3 things?
That's why I was asking.
He's trying to bundle it.
Oh, I see what you're doing.
Yeah. Full solar-powered system. And access to every electronic book that I have on my computer at the moment.
All right, that's good.
I like it.
Okay, so it's time to wrap up with part 1 of our 3-part series with Ellis Freedman. Stay tuned for the release of part 2 and 3 coming up soon, where we're going to be talking about career and industry challenges and also the greatest threats that face this nation. So stay tuned for that coming up.
The views expressed in this podcast are our own and not those of the companies we work for currently or previously, or of any person or organization affiliated or doing business with those companies.